This video is part of Project Homecoming, but more on that later. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, as its name suggests, was divided into two parts, the Austrian and the Hungarian. These parts were then further subdivided. On the Austrian side, today's Czechia was divided into Bohemia, Moravia and Silesia, and on the Hungarian side, today's Slovakia was, just Hungary. Hungary was very particular in its idea of who cares, it's all mine. Then again, that's the idea followed by any imperial nation, not just Hungary, but I digress. This direct control of Slovakia by Hungary for about 1,000 years, but more prominent in the last 200, meant that Slovaks, even though having a very small number of intellectuals, which ended up leading the nationalistic movement in the 19th and early 20th century, had practically speaking no middle or higher class. Most Slovaks were farmers, miners, and low-skilled factory workers. When we compare that to the Czechs, it's a very different picture. Bohemia was a very prominent kingdom within the HRE, and even though it then fell under the Habsburg control, it always retained a certain kind of autonomy, meaning the Czech people had a thriving middle class, an aristocracy, and numerous intellectuals. This is not to mean they weren't restrained at all by Austrian rules, and in fact almost any middle or high class Czech had to know German if they wanted to progress their career in any meaningful way, but when compared to the Slovaks, they were leaps ahead in social progress and personal freedoms. With all that said, by the end of the 19th century, both Czechs and Slovaks were fighting for some sort of an autonomy. Whether that be recognized equality within the empire or complete secession from it, depends on who you ask. There were many movements, each with a different goal and a different plan to get there. In Czechia, the most prominent political views by the end of the 19th century didn't really consider Slovakia. This is not to say there weren't any Czech movements for the formation of Czechoslovakia, or at the very least support for the Slovak brothers in one way or another, but none of these movements by the end of the 19th century were prevalent in the Czech mindset, being vastly overshadowed by the Czech fear of Germanification, which spurred up the Czech nationalistic movement campaign for equal rights and self-autonomy. Because if Czechs had the means to administer their own lands, they would no longer have to fear and could even counteract Germanification. But even though this idea was almost universal amongst all Czech political parties, they disagreed on how to tackle it. Nonetheless, by far the most prominent movement was best described by Karel Kramář, a Czech politician. The lands of the Bohemian crown formed an undividable and indivisible whole, completely independent and autonomous vis-a-vis the other lands of their king, hence advocating for remaining within the empire while gaining the autonomy like Hungary had. And in fact, by the end of the 19th century, many Czechs didn't want to secede from the empire, they just wanted more autonomy. Switching from the Czechs to Slovaks now, the most prominent and in fact the only faction to see some success in Slovak circles was the Nationalistic Party. By the late 19th and early 20th century, it had a newspaper based from Martin called Národné noviny, which was edited by Vajansky. This party, as its name suggests, was very much nationalistic with some members bordering on what we would today call fascism. Its agenda early on centered around the full secession from the empire and the creation of independent Slovakia. On top of that, the party was known for its Russophilia, anti-westernism, antisemitism, and agrarianism. After seeing no political success and very strong suppression by the Hungarians, the Nationalistic Party became less radical going into the 20th century, abandoning the idea of full secession of Slovakia and campaigning for universal suffrage and equal rights for Slovaks within the empire. However, anti-Westernism, anti-Semitism, and Russophilia still remained strong with the more right-leaning members of the party. Also, the idea of a Czechoslovakian state was very much a moot point within the nationalistic circles, not gaining any traction. And it is this political state that disgruntled young Slovaks found themselves around the turn of the century, with the only prominent political party being very conservative, and the Czechs pretty much minding their own business, giving the Slovaks a thumbs up of encouragement across the Morava. But this is all just one side of the story, and it is time to turn to the other side, which largely revolves around one man, known today as Tatíček Masaryk. Tomáš Masaryk was born in a small town of Hododin, right on the border between Czechia and Slovakia. When he was 6, his family moved to a neighboring town of Čejkovice. His father was a Slovak farmer and his mother a Germanized Moravian. Masaryk grew up speaking a Zahoracky Dialect of Slovak, but at an early age also learned German and Czech from his mother. He wasn't particularly fond of manual labor, preferring academia above all. For example, as a teenager, he taught himself Latin and ancient Greek just so he could read the original classical texts. He was also at the top of his class at a gymnasium in Brno and later Vienna. While there, he also learned French, Russian, Polish, and English, and earned a bit of money by translating documents from those languages to German or Czech. Interestingly, while he was at gymnasium, when he turned 17, he joined a number of young hotheads who sallied forth to fight for their country in the Austro-Prussian War, also known in Germany as the Unification War. He got injured during the war and recovered in Bratislava before finishing up his gymnasium, after which he continued pursuing his passion for academia, enrolling at the University of Vienna, from which he got his eventual doctorate in 1876. During this entire time, Masaryk wasn't involved much in politics, and even though he himself admitted to be a sympathizer for Czech and Slovak autonomy, outside of joining a few small Slovak and Czech student unions in Vienna, he never actively did anything. Instead, he was fully immersed in his studies of philosophy, history, psychology, etc. But that all changed in 1881/2 when he got a post as a philosophy professor at Charles University. It was in Prague that he was very much thrown onto the Czech political stage through the academic connections he made there, all of whom were already involved in politics. His early political life and ascendance is quite complicated, but the main event that can be pointed to is the Hilsner case. The Hilsner case was a series of trials against a Jewish peddler for committing a ritual murder of a young Czech girl. The evidence against him was laughable, and only situated on the unlikability of his character and the fact that he was Jewish. However, most of the Czech politics at the time involved anti-Semitism, and much of the public wanted to see someone face some repercussions. Masaryk, however, even though stating he wasn't very fond of Hilsner, decided to seemingly go against almost all politicians and the public opinion, because in his eyes this monstrous non-legality could not stand in a just nation. With Masaryk's help, Hilsner was still convicted, but instead of being executed, he was given life imprisonment. During this nationwide incident, Masaryk was shown to the entire population as an honest man and a fighter for justice. His idea of an unpleasant truth is preferable to a beneficial lie became one of his core political beliefs, and he went on to find a new political Czech party called the Realists in 1900. This party was meant to replace the current, Young Czech party that Masaryk viewed as pandering to the empire just as well as to the Czech people, resulting in nothing being done. The Realist party was very liberal for its time, equating for full equality of women in the workplace, universal suffrage, freedom of speech, etc. Also, unlike the Czech parties up until now, it actively worked with other Slavic parties in Austria-Hungary, including Croats, Serbs, Slovaks, etc. At the same time, Masaryk also helped coordinate a small number of Slovak intellectuals studying in Czechia to find a new political movement against the conservative Slovak nationalists. These people founded the newspaper Hlas that focused around social democratic ideas and became a prominent counter to the nationalistic party. As the Great War was drawing nigh, almost none of the major Czech or Slovak politicians, including Masaryk, propagated, at least officially, any idea of secession from the empire. Instead, they all supported the proposed federalist state of Austria-Hungary, which was also supported by Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It also has to be noted that outside of a small minority, like the group Československá jednota, the idea of a Czechoslovak state was never proposed on any major political level. Even Masaryk, though his actions and rhetoric in the early 19th century were very much so heading towards a unified Czechoslovakia, never actually publicly stated he wanted a Czechoslovak union until 1907. Most scholars today believe it was his plan all along to unify the Czechs and the Slovaks, a people who he called co-nationals. He just wanted to stir up more political support for such a move before declaring it officially. And reading his lecture notes, I think this becomes very clear. Nonetheless, whatever political agenda and views both sides had, when it became clear that the Great War was inevitable, the Czechs and Slovaks started to view a mutual cooperation as the best chance towards an independent and strong country. And just like that, Masaryk, who was working towards a unified Czechoslovak state for decades now, became the center point of the Czechoslovak independence movement during the war. At the start of the war, Masaryk viewed the German and Austrian mobilization, and he had this to say: I could not help feeling impressed by the purposeful German discipline and the preparedness to the last button. Throughout the mobilization, I did not see a single drunken German, whereas the contingents of the Austrian recruits on their way home to join the war were, for the most part, helplessly intoxicated. No real point for this quote, I just thought it was funny. However, two quotes do summarize Masaryk's life for the next 4 years quite well. Singer, a man who met Masaryk at the beginning of the war, said this: "The impression which Masaryk produced on me was extraordinary. He was entirely taken up with one single idea. This man, who was an Austrian against his will, was engrossed by the question whether the historical moment had come when the empire was to be split up into its national ingredients." During this time, Masaryk also met with Professor C.T. Watson, with whom he created the Memorandum for Central Europe. Watson later said this about that: "The program, which Masaryk placed before me at that secret meeting in a hotel Rotterdam in October 1914, was fulfilled almost to the letter in October 1918. So Masaryk had a plan, and he had the will to execute it. Therefore, the next 4 years, Masaryk took the initiative, almost single-handedly getting diplomatic support for the creation of Czechoslovakia across the world. He traveled to Rotterdam, Geneva, Paris, London, Petrograd, Moscow, Kiev, Vladivostok, Tokyo, Chicago, Washington, New York, London, Paris, and in 1918, Prague. Masaryk was the one to organize the Czechoslovak Legion in Russia, and later he was the one to negotiate safe passage of this legion across Russia. He also had time to be one of the founders of the UCL School of Slavonic and East European Studies in London, and many other things we don't have time to talk about. However, it wasn't all smooth sailing for gaining diplomatic support for the creation of Czechoslovakia. The most prominent opposition coming from the British, who didn't want to break up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, especially not at the start of the war. America, on the other hand, proved to be the most enthusiastic ally of Masaryk and his cause. When he arrived to Chicago, he was joyfully greeted by 150,000 people, most of which were of Czechoslovak origin. Eventually, thanks to Masaryk's unrelentless diplomatic work, a new nation was founded, a Czechoslovak nation. A nation comprised of two brothers, and a nation that Masaryk stressed should always remain unified, for only in unity can the small Czech and Slovak nations retain importance on a larger political stage. Unsurprisingly, Masaryk was elected as the first president of Czechoslovakia, and a new chapter not just in Masaryk's life but also in Czechoslovak history began. A chapter that until 1938 had a lot of its own problems, but that's a story for another time. This video is part of a greater project Homecoming, where for the holidays a bunch of history YouTubers are talking about the history of where they live or where they are from. Since I'm from Slovakia, I talked about the formation of Czechoslovakia. If you want to see the other history YouTubers videos, click the link to the playlist on the screen or in the description. My name is Emlaser, and see you next time.